Hello, my name is Ghinwa Hakim, and you are watching The Arabic Hour. Today, we bring you human rights activist Omar Barghouti, author of Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, BDS, The Global Struggle for Palestinian Rights.
Even in Israel, citizens of the State of Israel, the indigenous Palestinians who have been ethnically cleansed during the Nakba and since the Nakba, cannot go back to their villages because they're not Jewish. So they're citizens of a state that does not allow them to go home when they have the deeds because they're the wrong type. So this brings the issue of apartheid, which is very, very important, and it's the least understood. So many people think if Israel were to end the occupation tomorrow, everything will be fine and dandy. No, it won't. Israel will continue to be an apartheid state even if it ended the occupation tomorrow. So I'm sure if this is covered in the Boston Globe tomorrow, somebody will jump and say, see, proof. The BDS movement wants to destroy Israel. They want to wipe us off the face of the earth. But if anyone is sending the story to the Boston Globe, it's important to carry the context. No, we're not. We don't call for destroying anything. We're calling for building our rights, regaining our rights. We're calling for ending injustices.
On today's program, we bring you the first of many programs covering the 2014 Friends of Sabeel North America Conference, entitled The Israeli Occupation, Breaking a Generation. The conference focused on the question of how to bring peace and justice to Israel and Palestine, detailing the experience of Palestinian children under Israeli occupation of their land. It also addresses the effects of the occupation on Israeli youth. Among the speakers were Amel Bshara, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Tufts University, Dr. Mads Gilbert, ER Director who witnessed the effects of Gaza's bombardment, Sahar Vardi, Israeli conscientious objector, Marty Fetterman, Jewish educator with American Jews for a Just Peace, and Omar Barghouti, today's main feature, author of Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, BDS, The Global Struggle for Palestinian Rights. Omar Barghouti is a Palestinian researcher, commentator, and human rights activist committed to upholding international law and universal human rights. He is a founding member of the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, PACB, and the Palestinian Civil Society Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, BDS, campaign against Israel. His talk was entitled Using Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions to Achieve Change as part of a larger panel entitled What Can We Do? The panel was moderated by Caroline Hunter, co-initiator of the South African boycott.
So to begin, we've got a heroine from the Boston area, Caroline Hunter. You all know her. I just met her. Caroline was a chemist in the 70s at Polaroid in Cambridge when she challenged the company's technological support of the South African government's apartheid operations, the whole system, in the notorious passport photos. Hunter and Ken Williams organized the first boycott of a U.S. corporation for its apartheid role during that period. She was fired for these activities, but then she taught and worked in administration in Cambridge in the public schools. She then received the 2012 National Education Association's Rosa Parks Memorial Award and South African Partners Mandela Award for her anti-apartheid activism. So there's life after being fired. And she is here to testify what you can do. So Caroline, welcome. She's going to say a few words about the apartheid struggle and introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you.
That's the right height? Yeah, you got to speak close into it.
Okay. Come on, I hope.
Hold it, sure.
Yes, okay if I hold it. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Quite happy to be here and quite happy to lend my voice to any struggle for human rights, particularly that one of the Palestinians. Today is the 44th anniversary, give or take a month, of the Polaroid Revolutionary Workers Movement. Yes. So for some of you, this is a memory, and for many of you, I am history. No, I am. I really am. And I now can say I am a history maker. It took me a long time to acknowledge that. I was embarrassed by one of my students at Cambridge Ringelat when my late husband died, and they found out about me. They thought I was just a teacher. They thought I was Lizette's mother. They didn't know about my history. And she said I had no right to hold that information from them. And then today I am heartfelt because I am coming from burying my dear friend, Frances Cooper Berry, an educator from Boston and Cambridge, a good woman. Oh my God, what a good woman. But Frances is the reason why I have the NEA Rosa Parks Memorial Award. Frances is the reason why I got the MTA Louise Gaskins Lifetime Civil Rights Achievement Award. Because Frances, as a colleague, every time I say, "Oh, Frances, thank you for doing all this work," she'd say, "Caroline, your history is my job." And she was that kind of selfless woman. So I stand here heartfelt and dedicate this talk to Frances. Taking you back, this is October 4th, 1970. Ken Williams and I go into Polaroid, into my lab. Ron Chechu, where are you? Ron Chechu, I have to out him. He is the man who had the pleasure of firing me from Polaroid because he was my lab manager. But the fact that he's here says where his heart is and was. Nice. Love you, Ron.
I had no desire to fire me, but the boss said I had to fire him.
And I was fireable. So Sunday, October 4th, we use our Polaroid IDs. We get into Polaroid, and we put up this leaflet. And the leaflet says, "Polaroid imprisons black people in 60 seconds. They sold their ID2 system to South Africa and Rhodesia. They'll sell it to Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia too. Seize the times." And there was some other narrative. And so we go into Polaroid, and we put these leaflets up on company bulletin boards on the back of restaurant stalls. All over the company. We put them up really neatly, no tape. You know, stick pins. And then on the way out of the building, we said, "Oh, let's put them up where the corporate people park." And we did, or where all the vice presidents park, behind Osborne Street. And we went home. And when we got to work on Monday, the Polaroid police and the Cambridge police were looking for us. They let us go to work because they didn't know how big the protest was. On Wednesday, October 7th, we called for a rally in Technology Square. We subsequently found out through people in the community that the cab drivers in Tech Square had been replaced by police officers and FBI agents, and there were snipers on the roof. And several people in Polaroid were warned not to go because there could be violence. On Thursday, October 8th, we met with the Polaroid leaders and presented them, along with Chris Nteta, a South African divinity student whose life was seriously threatened because he had just come from South Africa. And he was there as a living witness to say, yes, I had my passport photo taken by Polaroid cameras. And Chris stood with us for 7 years until we got Polaroid out of South Africa. We presented Polaroid with 3 demands: that Polaroid denounce apartheid simultaneously in the US and South Africa, that they get out of South Africa, and that they turn their profits over to South Africa to the recognized liberation movements fighting for their freedom. On Tuesday, October 13th, this is a little local fact, NPR guru Steve Curwood was an intern at the Boston Phoenix, and nobody wanted to listen to us. So Steve wrote the first story about Polaroid, October 13th, 1970, in the then Boston Phoenix. And then I looked through some papers, and we had early news, Boston University newspaper, Southern University and Louisiana newspaper wrote about us, and Mass Strike wrote about us. And on October 18th, the Boston Sunday Globe finally acknowledged that there was a protest. We had made the national news, and I have to remind you, go back in time, 3 media outlets, ABC, NBC, and CBS. UPS, Associated Press, and 1 other. So when you made news, you made news. Okay? No computers, no cell phones, no social media, no personal computers, barely Xerox machines in industry. On Sunday, October 18th, the Globe published a 3-page article on the business section and did a deliberate no-no. They published my personal address in the paper, which everybody said, that's just to get you harmed. On October 27th, we called for an international boycott. And then by November 9th, we went to Tanzanian Standard. We were reading the South African newspapers. We were world news. Now, when you feel like you've made history, you have to try to figure out what was that moment. Ken Williams' work, I'm a bench chemist at Polaroid, first generation college graduate. As I tell young people, I came up here to be young and wild and free. I did not come to start a boycott. I did not, believe me, I did not. What's my train of thought? So we are faced with, so I go to pick up Ken from work, and for some reason we turn around and look at a bulletin board. I don't know what happened. We see a picture of the only other black guy in the division. It's a picture, and it's a mock-up for South Africa. Department of the Mines, Union of South Africa. And Ken said, I didn't know Polaroid was in South Africa. And I said, yeah, that's a really bad place for black people. I wish we were thieves, because I would have it to show you now. But we didn't know they were in South Africa, nor did we believe after we told people that people would not believe us. So we didn't take the ID. And because Polaroid was liberal, you could talk to the first vice president. Hey, Tom, what's Polaroid doing in South Africa? Oh, Ken, how'd you find out? That's 10,000 miles away. That's got nothing to do with you. You have a job. It's a small percentage of our business. Why are you worried about that? And so we went home and we did research. We really educated ourselves. Now, I learned about South Africa in 1962 at a little Catholic school in New Orleans, a little segregated Catholic school in New Orleans, Louisiana, Xavier University Preparatory, where my young white lay teacher, Mr. Valda, introduced us to Cry the Beloved Country. That book resonated perhaps with me riding behind the sign and drinking colored water and not being able to shop at Woolworths. Maybe that's why I felt it. And I memorized the opening paragraphs. There's a man lying in the grass, a storm. I can tell you the book. I wrote it inside my math book. And that was it. 64, I saw the Charlottesville Massacre. And that was it. And so back in Polaroid in 1970, now when I see the ID, I remember Mr. Valda. I remember my mother. I remember Dr. King saying, nobody's free unless everybody is free. And so we researched. We learned about apartheid. I can tell you about Milan and Verwoerd and all the guys who crafted South Africa's apartheid system. And when you go back, you got to find yourself in Nazi Germany. The Star of David, the tattoo on the arm, the original ID. So we educated ourselves and we decided we're working here. We don't think our work should have anything to do with that. And so we organized this protest. And here we are now calling for an international boycott. And I remember feeling my life is slipping away from me because I was young. And this is not what I planned to do. But I can tell you what we did. We educated ourselves. Thank you very much. We had a basic argument that appealed to everybody's humanity. You don't have to be black to end apartheid. You just have to be right thinking. If you remember the edge, you don't have to be Jewish to like rye bread. That's where we got it from. Seriously, Ken was a genius. Ken was a marketing genius because he used Polaroid's advertisement against them and he used everybody else's advertisement against them. He made the leaflets. He made the phrases. He was truly a genius. And Polaroid recognized that. Even after Ken was fired, his pictures were still in the corporation. They still own them in the archives. I have to go back and get them. We educated ourselves. We had that basic argument. That's the success of the movement. Coalitions with broad affiliations. We challenged Polaroid in every forum that existed, from the neighborhood to international conventions, to university forums, to the United Nations, to Congress. Ron Dellum still gives us credit for his sanctions bill because we were the first group that went to him. And from the time we met him in 1971 until 15 years later, he filed legislation against apartheid and has given us credit for it. We used the media. We knew how to make news. We used TV and radio outlets, letters to the editor, editorial, you name it, we did it. We were a nonviolent protest in the spirit of Dr. King. We participated in hand-to-hand contact, the original social media leafleting. Okay? From Mimeo leaflets, our first ones were crudely lettered, and eventually we went to printing. So when you first started leaflet, people were like, "Oh, I don't want that." But when it was printed, like, "What do you have today?" Okay? And then we said, "Well, take some and pass them along." We continued our internal education for ourselves and for our members. That's critical for a movement. We were present and active with solid core members and supporters. We affiliated with other groups like Science for the People. It requires sacrifice. It takes time. We need bodies on the line. We isolated South Africa and her partners in all forums: economics, sport, entertainment, and politics. And now I'm going to introduce you to the man who can do it for Israel. Omar Barghouti is a human rights activist. He tells me now that he was a participant in the Polaroid anti-apartheid movement in Colombia. So he comes with a history, he comes with a knowledge, he comes with a spirit and a compassion to change the plight of Palestinian children, to change the plight of our world. Injustice anywhere cannot be tolerated. Omar Barghouti.
I'm so glad to be with you here. It's very tough to speak after Mads Gilbert's presentation. Even for a Palestinian, it's very hard to speak. But I guess speak is what we must do, especially after that presentation, because we don't want you to get away from here just thinking that, you know, it's almost hopeless, because that's not Mads' message, that it's not hopeless. It's brutal, but it's not hopeless. There's a lot of hope. So I'll focus in my presentation on hope. True, I was an activist in the anti-apartheid movement at Columbia University, and I'm very proud of that history, a very little tiny part of that huge movement. But it was the first moment when I learned how hope is important, because then everyone else thought it would never succeed. And actually, I was studying engineering. No one is perfect. And then, and then a colleague asked me, "Do you really think apartheid will be abolished in your lifetime?" And I said, "No." So he said, "You're Palestinian. Why are you doing this? I mean, you have enough trouble on your own." I said, "Yeah, but to me, it's a universal issue. Victory in South Africa would be victory for us. I'm doing it out of moral conviction. Even if we don't succeed, I feel profoundly indebted to the struggle to do anything to end Columbia University's complicity in apartheid. So I did it out of a profound moral obligation. And apartheid did collapse in my lifetime. And no one can take that hope away from me." I'll start my presentation with Zev Jabutinski. For those who don't know him, Jabutinski was the leader of the far-right Zionist movement back in the 20s, the Reform Zionist movement. And Zionists then were quite honest, unlike now. So, for example, they called it the Jewish colonization of Palestine. That was the term they used, because that's what it was. Zev Jabutinski wrote this very, very important paper, little pamphlet, called The Iron Wall. So I'll just quote from Jabutinski. He wrote that in 1923. It's very important for our message today. Jabutinski said, "It's utterly impossible to obtain the voluntary consent of the Palestine Arabs for converting Palestine from an Arab country into a country with a Jewish majority." He said, "There is not one solitary instance of any colonization being carried on with the consent of the native population. The native populations, civilized or uncivilized," of course we were not, but anyway, have always stubbornly resisted the colonists, irrespective of whether they were civilized or savage. So he goes on to say, and this is the punchline, every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That's why he suggested an iron wall that the colonized, the indigenous population, cannot breach. And that's an iron wall in the head to convince the native population that it's impossible to win. So give up and accept reality. Instead of thinking of rights, you start thinking of realities. That's Jabutinski's genius concept of the iron wall. So what we heard about the Dahiya doctrine, what Israel is doing in Gaza, what Israel has been doing to the Palestinians for the last 6+ decades, has this iron wall as part of the pillars of the Zionist ideology. They want us to give up hope, first and foremost, and to accept colonization as a fact, as fate, actually. But the movement I helped to co-found in 2005, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, is, I think, one response to this iron wall. Now, far from being hopeless and giving up, we're quite hopeful. We're quite optimistic. We're smelling a South Africa moment as we speak. And I think Israel's massacre in Gaza might well be its main undoing of its regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. Today, John Kerry and Obama hint at BDS. Netanyahu mentions it 18 times in his speech to AIPAC. The Israeli government considers it an existential threat, and in fact, they've openly said it's a serious existential threat, that they moved, a strategic threat, they moved overall responsibility for fighting BDS from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, June of 2013. Why did this happen? How can an initially small, non-violent, human rights-based movement become a security, strategic, major threat to a state that has hundreds of nuclear bombs, that is very powerful financially, economically, you name it, mainly thanks to you, your government? How can it feel such a threat from a non-violent human rights movement that's based on international law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? It does not make sense. It makes all the sense. Nuclear powers cannot bomb the Presbyterian Church when it adopts a divestment from HP and Caterpillar. You know, what can they do when the Norwegian pension fund divests from companies involved in the occupation? What are they going to do to academics in the Asian American Studies or American Studies Association or African Literature Association or many of the other academic associations in this country that have adopted a full academic boycott of Israel? Shoot them dead? So that's the limit of Israel's power. And BDS really tests that limit. We found Israel's Achilles heel. The Achilles heel of that otherwise massive, invincible regime of oppression. We found its Achilles heel in the BDS movement. Non-violent resistance of the type that we're doing is just penetrating through Israel's regime's defenses, and they cannot do much to stop us. I'll give some examples, especially after Gaza, or maybe in the last year, of some BDS successes, and then I'll go back to the origins of the movement, why we've launched BDS, some of the challenges we face, and then end with what can be done. Although I never preach what should be done in any place, because one of the main principles of the BDS movement is context sensitivity, which means any one of you knows best what can be done in Boston than I can. Because you know the context, you know the particularities, I don't. But I'll share with you some success stories, some experiences from around the world, and some of what we as Palestinians think should be done. But it's up to you to do what you can do. So BDS had reached a tipping point even before the latest Israeli massacre in Gaza. And I'll talk a bit about that, and then I'll move to Gaza. Even before the latest massacre in Gaza, as I mentioned, academic associations in the United States, several of them have adopted a full academic boycott of Israel. And do not undermine this point. These are academic associations in the United States, not in Egypt, Bangladesh, or Brazil, where you have natural support for Palestinians. This is in the United States, where support for Israel is still much higher than support for Palestinians. So breaking that taboo at such a level in the academic ivory tower is very telling. It's very, very important for the future of the movement here. But aside from that, major academics from Stephen Hawking in the UK to others have endorsed a boycott, or at least heeded a boycott, of Israeli conferences, Israeli events. Many major artists have as well kept away from Israel. So Israel started feeling in the academic and cultural sphere like South Africa used to during the 80s, end of 80s, when it started to feel really isolated. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. They know that, and we know that. But it wasn't just in the academic and cultural sphere. It's not just Irish academics adopting a full academic boycott of Israel as they have done in 2013. It's not just Belgian students, 100,000 members of the Belgian Federation of Francophone Students adopting a full academic boycott. It's not just that. We started hitting the economic sphere. And that's 2014. This is this year, when we started to have a real economic impact. Even before 2014, we had some economic impact, but not so much as we're having now. So in 2014, we started seeing huge pension funds around the world, like the Dutch pension fund, the second largest Dutch pension fund, PGGM, divest from Israeli banks involved in the occupation. Banks. We're not talking about little SodaStream, although I'll get to SodaStream later, or Scarlet. No, now we're talking about banks affected. Yes, the impact in terms of dollars and cents is not huge yet, but it's Israeli banks being divested by a European state pension fund. European pension fund. Very important. The Norwegians did as well. The largest sovereign fund in the world, the Norwegian pension fund, divested from several Israeli companies involved in the occupation. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, after an intense BDS campaign, had to divest from G4S, the company that FOSNA is adopting a campaign against. G4S, as you know, is the largest security company in the world. It's involved in the Israeli prison systems, where torture is practiced regularly, in the checkpoints, in the colonies, in the occupied territories, and so on. So G4S is an excellent example of a BDS target. Bill Gates had to divest from G4S, $182 million. And so did the United Methodist Church. And that was a very tough struggle. Those of you who are Methodists would know how difficult that struggle was to get the pension fund of the United Methodist Church to drop G4S. And there's a lot of struggle still going on for other targets. And of course, the Presbyterian Church, after 10 years of struggle, finally adopted divestment from Motorola Solutions, Caterpillar, and HP, which was a huge victory for every activist who worked on that in this country, within the church, Jewish Voice for Peace, American Muslims for Palestine, AFSC, everyone who worked on this. This was a huge victory, and it took 10 years to get there. In Latin America, we saw 5 Latin American countries take some form of sanction against Israel, suspending free trade agreement discussions, pulling out ambassadors from Tel Aviv, or other form of sanctions, which is very, very important that this starts in Latin America. We also saw some companies starting to pull out of Israel, quietly, without much of a fuss, but they're doing it. A company like G4S, I mentioned, at their AGM, the annual general meeting of their shareholders in London just very recently, promised that they will start to pull out from Israel, from the Israeli prison systems completely. By 2017, they will end that phasing out of their business in Israel. Now, for such a huge corporation to admit that BDS is impacting its profits so much that they will start to pull out from Israeli business that violates international law is extremely important. We were not there a year ago. This is only in 2014 that we're seeing this economic impact take place. So now the BDS movement is taken much more seriously. And there are many, many other examples. I won't bore you with details, but there are many examples. And of course, on the New York Times pages, we saw an ad by 327 Jewish Holocaust survivors and their descendants, where they completely called to stop genocide in Gaza and called for BDS. And of course, after the massacre in Gaza, during the massacre in Gaza, Evo Morales became the first head of state to endorse BDS, and we're very proud of that. The national executive of the National Union of Students, the British Student Union, which has 7 million members, something to envy in this country. They do have a union that has 7 million members of students, adopted BDS just very recently during the war on Gaza. Some Israeli companies started reporting major losses in their sales in Europe, especially Scandinavia, but not just. And of course, the famous SodaStream that said BDS was a nuisance that cannot affect it. So its share dropped by 72%. And has recently announced that they're closing down their West Bank colony factory, finally. I guess nuisance can be very effective. And of course, we cannot forget the block the boat activities in this country, in California especially. Community activists and dock workers, heroic dock workers in Oakland, California, blocked an Israeli ship, blocked offloading or loading an Israeli ship for 4 consecutive days during the massacre, and they repeated their action. And then it went to Los Angeles and Seattle and Florida, and it started to grow. It's not huge yet, but this is making history. In the United States, seeing Israeli ships being blocked for days on end is history. Several city councils in Scotland, Turkey, and elsewhere completely boycotted Israeli goods. Until now, it's ongoing. They said we will not allow any Israeli products into the entire cities. And this is happening 4 city councils in Scotland, 12 in Turkey, and others. So we're seeing some sanctions, we're seeing some boycotting in all spheres, and we're seeing a lot of impact on Israel. This is why they're starting to feel that this is really a strategic threat to their regime of oppression. And we can see that going forward will have even more of an impact. This is why earlier this year, the Israeli government had a special session to discuss a new strategy for fighting BDS, because their strategy clearly did not succeed. Since 2005, since BDS was launched, their strategy was based on propaganda, the Brand Israel campaign. Send our artists and nanotechnologists and musicians and academics to show Israel's prettier face. That's exactly what they said in their propaganda brochures. It did not work. You commit a massacre in Gaza and then you send the Batsheva dance company, it doesn't help. You know, people are not stupid. People can realize you're whitewashing. And South Africa did exactly that. So people are not stupid. People get it. So what is BDS? So I started from the reverse, where we are today. The Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement was launched in the historic call of BDS in 2005 by the absolute majority of Palestinian civil society. This is one point that's always forgotten in any coverage of BDS. So yes, our victories are being covered very well now, including in the New York Times and Washington Post and CNN, but you don't hear much that this is the widest coalition in Palestinian society. You're left to think maybe this is some British leftist thing, you know? Or some crazy Jewish activists out in California doing it. You don't get the fact that this is the largest coalition in Palestinian society, including all political parties, all trade unions, all women's unions, students, youth, farmers, academics, you name it. It's the largest coalition in Palestinian society leading the global BDS movement. So it's a Palestinian-led human rights movement, non-violent movement, based entirely on international law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As such, it's an anti-racist movement. We reject every form of racism, including anti-Semitism, and we're not shy about that. We do not accept anti-Semites within our ranks. We do not work with anti-Semites. We reject every form of racism against every human being, regardless of ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, what have you, color, and so on. And this is very important for us as a movement. It's an inclusive movement. As one South African jurist said, this is the human rights movement of today. The world today, this is the main human rights movement of today. As South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement used to be in the 80s and 70s. Today, it's the BDS movement for Palestinian rights. So BDS calls for ending the three forms of oppression, the key three forms of oppression that Palestinians suffer from. The occupation, including the colonies, the wall, and so on. And by that we mean the 1967 occupation specifically. Ending, number two, ending the system of racial discrimination within Israel itself, which amounts to apartheid. And number three, the right of return for refugees. Denial of that right is the biggest injustice that Palestinians are suffering from. But it might be a bit, troubling. It's inconvenient. Why do you have to focus on all these three rights? Why can't you just stick to ending the occupation, which we understand, and it's easier to deal with? Because even the New York Times can deal with that. Well, we do not shape our rights according to what's convenient for the New York Times. Our rights are inherent in us because we're human and because we're equal humans, and we deserve equal rights to all other humans. As such, we do not compromise our basic rights. As Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's our biggest supporter in South Africa, once said, "I'm not interested in picking up crumbs of compassion thrown from the table of someone who considers himself my master. I want the full menu of rights." And we won't accept anything less than the full menu of rights. Now, that's the first aspect of BDS. It's the rights part, which is not negotiable. Our basic rights are not negotiable. The very nuanced and selective and context-sensitive part is the tactics. The boycotting, the divesting, the sanctions. That's very context-sensitive. So that depends on what can be done. What we call for in Berlin is very different than what we call for in Johannesburg or Delhi. It's very different because the context is very different. We don't change our principles, but we change our tactics. We modify our tactics according to a special particularity, a special context. So in Berlin, BDS activists tell us, we cannot call for a boycott of Israel. Okay, you can't, so don't. What can you do? They said, okay, we can boycott companies producing in settlements. Great. We can call for a military embargo. Fine. Whatever can be done, so long as no one tries to undermine our three basic rights. So you can boycott one particular company. We're fine with that, and we'll work with you strategically to achieve that. But do not undermine our rights in the process. So do not say, oh, we oppose that right of return for refugees, that's too radical. Too radical for whom? It's for the 68% of the Palestinians who are refugees, that's their basic right, according to international law. We're not asking for the moon. Palestinians are divided in three parts. About 38% are in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem. 12% are in the State of Israel as second-class citizens, and 50% are in exile. But even among Palestinians in the occupied territories and in Israel, there's a huge minority of internally displaced persons, refugees, who cannot go home because they're the wrong type, basically. Even in Israel, citizens of the State of Israel, the indigenous Palestinians who have been ethnically cleansed during the Nakba and since the Nakba, cannot go back to their villages because they're not Jewish. So they're citizens of a state that does not allow them to go home when they have the deeds because they're the wrong type. So this brings the issue of apartheid, which is very, very important, and it's the least understood. So many people think if Israel were to end the occupation tomorrow, everything will be fine and dandy. No, it won't. Israel will continue to be an apartheid state even if it ended the occupation tomorrow. So I'm sure if this is covered in the Boston Globe tomorrow, somebody will jump and say, see, proof. The BDS movement wants to destroy Israel. They want to wipe us off the face of the earth. But if anyone is sending the story to the Boston Globe, it's important to carry the context. No, we're not. We don't call for destroying anything. We're calling for building our rights, regaining our rights. We're calling for ending injustices. If ending an injustice is understood as destroying a system, what does that say about that system? If equality would destroy Israel, what does that say about Israel? We want equality. If somebody sees that as their destruction, well, you think about it. So that's the key point, that we cannot deal with just partial set of our rights. Now, aside from all the rights, how to campaign, how to do BDS is very important, and it's very dependent on the context. And we cannot just copy-paste from any history. We're very inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement. We learned a lot. We continue to learn a lot through our direct contact with leaders in South Africa who led the ANC and the anti-apartheid movement. We're very much inspired by the civil rights movement in this country. We also learned a lot from that, from the Gandhi-led revolution in India. We learned from all that, and from many others. But BDS is first and foremost a Palestinian movement that is rooted in a very long heritage of Palestinian popular resistance, which is hardly ever recognized or acknowledged in the West, especially. So it's very important to remember that. So what can be done? As I said, what should be done is up to you. What can be done? Quite a lot. To keep hope alive is very, very important. To counter Jabutinski's hopelessness is very important, not just in Gaza, in Boston as well. There's a lot of hopelessness about the ability of activists to change this seemingly invincible reality. South Africa was peanuts compared to Israel. I mean, Israel has the entire Congress in its pocket. South African apartheid never had that luxury. At best, they had a majority in Congress, but not 100%. I mean, you can't get Congress to vote on anything American 100%. I mean, they'll always disagree on any. I mean, it's only on Israel where you get this 100%. And you don't need me to tell you that your Congress epitomizes the corruption, the institutional corruption of politics. I mean, this is the case study, the textbook study of corruption in politics is your Congress. So, do I call for, write a letter? We heard a lot about write a letter to your congressman or woman. With all due respect to other speakers, if you only have 5 minutes a day, I would not waste it on writing a letter to your congressman or woman.
You are watching Omar Barghouti, author of Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, BDS, The Global Struggle for Palestinian Rights, as part of our coverage of the recent Friends of Sabeel North America conference entitled The Israeli Occupation, Breaking a Generation, that took place this past November in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Stay tuned, we'll be back with the remainder of Omar Barghouti's talk after this short break.
You are watching The Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Seriously, I mean, I would do that if I had the luxury of time. After I've done my basic activism, then, and I have, the luxury of 5 more minutes, I would write a letter to my congressperson just to keep nagging, to be a nuisance. Without much, nothing will happen, but just to be a nuisance. But something will happen after we build the movement. That's what happened in South Africa. And Caroline knows much more about this than I. At some point, many people were hopeless, but we always kept the hope alive. And we kept building the anti-apartheid movement in this country, one church at a time, one union at a time, one student council at a time, until it became a mass movement. Congress people will not wake up and be moral. Don't even think about it. No way. No way. I mean, that might happen in 2 centuries, but not today. What they will listen to is money or power of the masses. If they feel they might lose the next election, they will listen. So if we cannot bring up masses affecting them, they will not even respect anything we demand of them in any letter. So we can write 1,000 letters. If they get votes by hundreds of thousands, that's irrelevant to them. They've got to see the numbers or the money. We don't have money, so let's get the numbers. That's our strength. We don't have money, we have numbers. So we need to build the movement from the grassroots up. And then we can demand of Congress, not beg of them, not persuade them, thou shalt do what I tell you, otherwise you get kicked out of office. That's the only language Congress people listen to. Not, oh please, it's immoral what Israel is doing. Yeah, okay. So what? It's immoral what they do in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq and Yemen and everywhere in the world. This country has been built on immorality. So what are we preaching to Congress? To become moral? I mean, that's not going to happen. We have to force them to do the right thing through our votes, through our numbers, by building the grassroots movement from underneath up. So boycotting, it's important to remember, boycott is not just about companies. It can be a company that's profiting from the occupation. It can be just a company involved in other human rights violations. But that's important. But it's also academic and cultural boycott. So when Israel sends a cultural ambassador to whitewash its crimes in Gaza, it's important to counter that. It's important to stand up to that and expose it as a whitewashing brand Israel routine that Israel does after every massacre it does against the Palestinians or Lebanese or others. So it's important to do boycotting, but not as an individual exercise, because that's not effective. In everything we do, it has to be a community exercise. It could be a church community, a university community, student community, women's community, feminist, whatever, as long as it's a community activity, because then it has a lot more impact and it becomes more viral. It affects other communities. Saying that, it's very important to remember that we've got to build cross-movement alliances and partnerships. We cannot do it alone. Palestine is not the only injustice in the world. There's so many in inner cities in this country. We don't have to go to Somalia or Iraq. I mean, in this country, in every major city in this country, there's so much injustice. So why should black activists in Ferguson give a damn about Palestine? Well, you ask them and they say, we see the connections. That's why we give a damn. That's why we need to build alliances, because it's the same oppressor. Our oppressors are so united that we must get our act together and unite. If we think about justice for Palestine as separate from other struggles for freedom, justice, equal rights, anti-discrimination in this country and around the world, we're not looking far enough. We're not looking with a vision to the future. We've got to build cross-movement alliances. Divestment, as happened with the Presbyterians, as should happen with every church. We need to clean the pension funds of churches and unions and associations in this country of investments in companies that violate our rights. And this is not a charity. We're not asking for a charity. And this is not an altruistic exercise. This is a basic moral obligation. You have a basic moral obligation not to be partner in crime. So when we ask you to pull your investments out of crime, we're not asking you for anything heroic. We're asking you for something really basic. Don't share in a crime. It's not a charity, it's an obligation. And what Martin Luther King said about the boycott at a very simple level, withdrawing support for an evil system or policy, rings so true today. Withdrawing support for an evil system or policy is not heroic. It's a basic moral act that every decent human being should do out of their own conscience, not feeling altruistic, dropping every other cause I'm involved in to do this. No, 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 you don't drop any other cause. This is a basic obligation that you do along with other causes, whatever your other causes might be. Sanctions, so it's not a coincidence that it's B, D, and then S. Sanctions come last. After we do a lot of boycotting, a lot of divesting, then we have some hope of pressuring government, city councils up to federal government to take action. Can we clean up city councils' funds or contracts from companies violating Palestinian rights? Yes, if we do it smartly. If we look at the connections, like Sahar earlier in the morning showed that G4S, which is involved in the Israeli prison systems, is involved in the wall with Mexico. Can we connect the struggles? Can we see the connections between security companies in US inner cities, Israeli prisons, and make that connection? So when we call for divesting from a company like G4S, we're not just saying for Palestine. And I think in Boston here, the huge success against Veolia, which was one of the biggest successes in the BDS movement, is very important to remember. It wasn't just the Palestine solidarity activists leading that. Of course, they played the key role. But it was unions and Jewish groups and feminist groups and a huge coalition of groups, because no one likes their public transportation privatized. People hate that. Good, so let's connect struggles. So the struggle for Palestinian rights against Veolia would connect with other struggles. That's why we had this huge success in Boston, where Veolia lost a contract last year worth $4.24 billion, one of its largest failures ever to win that huge public transport contract. And where's Nancy? Nancy Moore is somewhere here. And Nancy was very deeply involved in many other activists, so you all deserve a big hand. And Veolia, as Nancy knows, just very recently lost 2 contracts in Kuwait worth $2.25 billion. And this was by the government of Kuwait. The government of Kuwait said, the city of Kuwait and then other government officials said, after receiving an appeal by the Palestinian BDS National Committee to divest from Veolia, and after investigating Veolia's involvement in Israeli violations of international law in the occupied territories, we decided to exclude Veolia from this and that contract and from every future contract until they stop their complicity in Israeli violations. So Veolia is finished in Kuwait. That's a huge victory for the BDS movement. So to end, because I'm interested in your questions, in the discussion afterwards, so I must end. To end, I will end with something unconventional, I suppose. In his poem, Message to the Living, Henk van Radwijk, I'm not very good with Dutch names, a Dutch poet of resistance against the Nazi German occupation of the Netherlands during World War II, wrote, "A people giving in to tyrants will lose more than body and souls, more than body and goods. The light will be extinguished." End of quote. On Sunday, September 14th of this year, a few weeks after the end of the Israeli massacre in Gaza, and despite all the death, destruction, and trauma, hundreds of thousands of Gaza's children almost literally rose from under the rubble that much of Gaza was reduced to and went with enthusiasm to their damaged schools, carrying their dusty books and injured souls. Their eyes were shining with hope for a dignified life. BDS empowers Palestinians and worldwide supporters of a just peace to keep this hope alight. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. You see, a message of hope is something we do proactively, and we all can do. So let's take some questions. I know your group, I assume it's the International Call for BDS, doesn't deal with anti-Semites. But our detractors say that we are anti-Semites when we support BDS. And unfortunately, there might be some who are. What should we do and how should we handle this?
Those who accuse BDS of anti-Semitism for the mere fact that it's calling for a boycott of Israel because it's violating international law are making an anti-Semitic statement themselves. Calling a boycott of Israel anti-Semitic per se, inherently anti-Semitic, is an anti-Semitic statement because it's equating Israel and the Jews completely. It's saying that Israel and the world Jewry are one and the same. Israel is entirely and fully representative of Jewish populations around the world. Anyone who puts all Jews in one basket is an anti-Semite. It could be Netanyahu, or it could be a real Christian, Muslim, Hindu anti-Semite. It does not matter. It does not matter. Zionists quite a lot adopt anti-Semitic sentiments and statements, and we should call it that. It's anti-Semitic to put all Jews in one basket and say Israel represents them. When somebody is boycotting Israel, it's not because of any kind of assumed ethnicity or religious identity. It's because it's oppressing on other people and violating international law. If somebody calls for a boycott of Saudi Arabia, is it Islamophobic? No, it's not. If a women's movement in Saudi Arabia says, boycott the regime in Saudi Arabia because it violates our women's rights, I would be the first to sign that statement. And it would not be Islamophobic. It would be against the regime in Saudi Arabia. Why is it only when it comes to Israel do we hear this nonsense? It's intellectual terrorism. It's intellectual terrorism. They're bullying everyone in this country not to consider action against Israel, because otherwise, the boogeyman will come out. You'll be called an anti-Semite, so you'll be isolated in whatever you do. If you're an academic, you're finished. If you're even Jewish academic, you're also finished, but a little more likely. So we have to counter this terrorism, this intellectual terrorism, and insist that we make a distinction between a regime. We lost the battery has gone dead.
Does it still have?
Yeah, it's still on.
It's still on.
Oh, we'll get you another battery.
The battery is dead.
Okay.
I'll try to shout.
Talk loudly, I'll get you another battery.
Okay.
I'm not very good at shouting, but I'll try. So the main point is that we distinguish between any racism or racist action against Jews and action against Israel as a state, as a regime of occupation, apartheid, and settler colonialism. It's not the same at all. So we have to insist on an anti-racist platform, on rejecting every form of racism. And if they call us anti-Semites, we should not get intimidated. Quite often we do not respond. There's a very important principle in the BDS movement. It's the capital I principle. Ignore.
That was Omar Barghouti, author of Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, The Global Struggle for Palestinian Rights, talking at the Friends of Sabeel North America Conference. Tune in next week for more coverage of the recent Friends of Sabeel North America Conference entitled The Israeli Occupation, Breaking a Generation, that took place this past November in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Stay tuned, there's more to come after this short program ID.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Thank you so much for joining us at the Arabic Hour today. Some stations will be leaving us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. For those of you staying with us for the remainder of the hour, we hope you enjoy the last musical segment following the closing credits. On behalf of all of the volunteers here at the Arabic Hour, this is Ghanwa Hakim, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdullah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience, the American Arabic Benevolent Association, ABA, an umbrella association for community endeavors, the Nicholas G. Barham Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride, and by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.